I'm pleased to welcome you back to our Voter Education Project series, and believe it or not, we're less than 2 weeks out, and that means that this is our second to last installation of that. The final installment will be next Wednesday, the 28th at 1 p.m., featuring Michael Anton. I'll have more details on that at the end of the program. You can register, and you can also find an archive of all of our previous election webinars on our website, securefreedom.org. Meanwhile, today's program is entitled New U.S. Security Threats and America First, featuring our guests Rebeccah Heinrichs and Harry Kazianis, and moderated by Center President and CEO Fred Fleitz. Please note you are in listen-only mode, but you can submit your text questions in the Q&A box on the GoToWebinar control panel, and we will get to as many questions as possible at the end of the program. This event is being recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/securefreedom, and on our website, securefreedom.org. With that, I'll hand it to our president, Fred Fleitz.
Hey, Adam, thank you. And I'd like to thank all of our viewers for tuning in today. As Adam said, this is the second to the last of our voter education webinars on national security. The reason the center did these is because we believed over the summer that there are many crucial national security issues that voters should be considering when they cast their ballots this fall that probably would not be discussed during the campaign. And I think as you've been watching the campaign, you know that that is true. We believe there will be very serious challenges facing our country in 2021. And it's pretty clear that each presidential candidate have vastly different approaches to national security. So we're going to try to get into that today. And I'm pleased to say I have two outstanding experts to discuss this with. I'm sure you know both of them because they do many TV appearances, especially on the Fox News channel. Rebeccah Heinrichs is a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute, where she specializes in nuclear deterrence and missile defense. She also is an adjunct professor at the Institute of World Politics, where she teaches nuclear deterrence theory. Rebeccah, welcome.
Thank you.
Also joining us is Harry Kazianis. He is the Senior Director of Korea Studies at the Center for the National Interest, and he also is executive editor of its publishing arm, the National Interest. He's held positions as a senior fellow at the China Policy Institute, the Potomac Foundation, and CSIS. Harry, welcome.
Hey, Fred, thanks for having me.
I wanted to start out with a general discussion of the foreign policy approaches of each candidate. Now, President Trump has taken an unconventional approach to national security, which he calls America First. It has sort of thrown out the diplomatic rule book in dealing with foreign policy issues. He and his supporters claim that he has been quite successful, particularly concerning the Middle East, and they have rejected the conventional approach of prior Republican and Democratic administrations. Vice President Biden, on the other hand, favors a traditional approach to foreign policy, working through the United Nations, and has been very critical of the Trump administration's approach to national security and believes that there has to be a significant change. So, Rebeccah, I'd like to start with you. How would you compare the two foreign policies of the presidential candidates?
Sure, thanks, Fred. Well, I'll start with the Trump administration's foreign policy. What I have observed after, almost 4 full years of the first term of the Trump administration is that really it's unconventional for recent history, but it's not unconventional if you look at the long view of American history. And I don't mean, certainly the president's own personality and style are unique to him, but I really do see it as a sort of it's a correction from at least the last several decades of a blurring of borders and boundaries and more of a globalist, internationalist way of doing business. And the Trump administration is kind of going back to a correction of that. I think of it more of H.W. Bush, where you're seeing more of a, each individual country has its own inherent qualities, objectives, interests, and borders mean something. And the United States should go back to the well of prudent American statecraft. So where we engage militarily, we should have clear objectives and we should achieve them and get out. It's a more humble approach to doing business. It does not have a the United States kind of sits atop of the world, and where President Obama saw himself as kind of the the world leader, and the United States certainly should have a leadership role. But I mean, the American president is primarily, he's the head of state of the United States' executive branch. He's the head of the executive branch, and so needs to put American security and the interests and desires of the American people above, say, the European Union or other competing goals and objectives. And so that's the Trump approach. And it doesn't mean that we go it alone, but it means that, you know, international organizations are not ends in of themselves, but they're means to achieve American objectives. And so if they don't suit American objectives, they might have to be amended or tweaked, or the United States can withdraw from them. And we've seen this Trump administration being very willing to withdraw from Cold War treaties and other partnerships or alliances or multilateral organizations that no longer help the United States, or on net harm the United States more than they help. I think of like the WHO, for instance, or the UN Human Rights Council, which really became just an organization that was anti-Israel and didn't distinguish between, you know, humane nations that value the same kind of things we do in a liberal democracy, but were authoritarian in nature. And so that's the Trump approach. And of course, China is the primary driving threat for the United States, is now back in the game of major power competition rather than looking at the Middle East and terrorism as the primary threat. So that's the Trump administration. I'm sorry that's so long, but I would just say that the Biden administration wants to go back to the pre-Trump era, I would say. There are two warring groups within the Biden camp. I think one wants to sort of adapt to what the Trump administration has accomplished. And then there's the other kind of just old Obama ways, Samantha Power, Susan Rice, go back to the way of doing business, and wants to say America is back and let's forget the Trump days. And those are the people who are beloved by more of Western Europeans, European Union, and then they don't want to take this hard approach to compete with and confront with the Chinese Communist Party, and so they see priorities differently. And of course, they don't value a hard power and a strong, robust, fully resourced Department of Defense, and especially the nuclear modernization budget like the Trump administration does. And you've seen things like Hillary Clinton op-eds saying that there's been an over-militarization of foreign policy and we need to spend more on things for like climate change and pandemic and healthcare and that kind of thing as well. So those are the two very broadly, I think, different camps. And I will leave it at that so you can turn it over to Harry.
Well, Harry, I want to turn to you, and I'd like you to factor in one particular aspect that comes up frequently with Trump foreign policy, and that is his promise to keep the U.S. out of unnecessary wars and to end endless wars.
Well, thanks, Fred, and thanks, Rebecca. Thanks to the center. You know, thanks for everybody for joining us in these crazy times. I hope everybody's doing well. Look, I think this is a question that deserves a lot of focus, and unfortunately, the media is wrapped up on a lot of very important domestic issues at the moment. But you know, as Fred said in his opening, in 2021, we are going to confront a lot of big foreign policy challenges. So it's important to get these views out in the open. So just want to start there. Let me start with Trump's foreign policy, or what's been called America First. I feel like I've been talking about this for a long time because it was actually at the Center for the National Interest where Trump actually laid out the America First doctrine or strategy, if you will, a little over 4 years ago now. And I think that strategy has evolved. I think it's gone through some changes over the last few years. But I think very broadly, Trump has a couple of different goals for his agenda, if you will. Now, a lot of people have been very frustrated with America First. And the reason being is because I think a lot of our political scientists, professional think tankers, you know, people who are used to foreign policy being put into a nice little box, and we can say that it has very certain characteristics. You know, we like to label people certain things, whether it's liberal internationalist, neoconservative, isolationist, realist. We like to do that, and that's a good way to frame things, right? Unfortunately, Donald Trump's America First strategy doesn't really lend itself to that sort of framing. And I think that upsets a lot of people for a lot of different reasons. And I think it's really easy to understand why he doesn't sort of do that. He's not a political scientist. He's not a think tanker. He's a businessman. I think he has an overall vision for where he wants to go with American foreign policy. But if you're trying to put it in a box, good luck, because you just can't really do that. But as for what that vision is, I think there's a couple big themes here. I think the first thing, and Rebeccah laid a lot of these things out, is to really make sure that America's national security focus is based on just a few core objectives. And I think the first thing, that's very broad, is to make sure American national power and American primacy, to use that maybe overused political science term, is kept at the focus. So that means abrogating trade agreements that aren't America's national interest. That means dumping treaties that maybe don't fit America's agenda anymore as Trump sees it. That means putting pressure on allies, and whether it's NATO, South Korea, probably soon Japan, to pay more for that common collective defense. And I think that also means spending more on defense in areas where maybe there's been some underspending or needless cuts, as we saw in sequestration during the Obama years. So I think overall, that is sort of maybe the Trump vision, if you will. Now, Fred asked me to talk a little bit about these forever wars, the term endless wars. And I think it's important to discuss. I mean, I've been very lucky at my time at the center. I've had the opportunity to go to all different parts of the country and talk about foreign policy and really engage with people on these issues. And the one theme that I always hear over and over is, why does America always have to put boots on the ground? Why are we always the ones that seems to have to take the leadership role? Why is it American, men and women, the ones getting hurt and injured in all of these different conflicts, especially in the Middle East? Well, I mean, I think that's a whole other panel for itself. But I think Trump recognizes this. It's been something he's been talking about for a really long time. And I think what his inclination is to pull back from some of these areas in the world where America has expended a lot of blood and treasure. I think his inclination, and I think it, quite frankly, is wrong, is to pull out completely from Afghanistan, to completely pull out of Syria. Name your hotspot. It seems like Trump's inclination is to sort of pull back and retrench from these parts of the world. I think, though, his mind, I think there is an argument to be made to try to convince him that at least a footprint in these parts of the world is a good idea, especially in Afghanistan. I know there's been a lot of talk about having 2,500 troops in Afghanistan for intelligence gathering, to make sure that we don't have another 9/11. I think you can make that argument to Trump. I think he would be persuaded by that. I think also in other parts of the Middle East, you can make those arguments to him, as long as there's not a massive footprint, as long as we're not fighting, quote unquote, a conventional war, but we're there for intelligence gathering. I think you could make that argument to him. So I think I'll stop there for Trump, because I think we could go all day on that one. As for Biden,
I want to interrupt you. Very brief. Talk about what a Biden administration's foreign policy would be.
Yes, just going there. So in terms of Biden, I think Rebeccah lays this out pretty well. There are these warring camps, but in sort of the democratic progressive spheres of foreign policy thinking, and you can see this all through the various think tanks that support these views. For me, talking to a lot of these people, as I do for National Interest, a lot of them write for us and give us their opinions and write articles. My opinion is, it seems like they do want to go more back to the Obama years. As Rebeccah said, America's back on the world stages, if you will. And I think, just quick hits on some of the things they do, I think a Biden administration would try to re-enter the Iran nuclear deal, which I think would be a mistake for a lot of different reasons, or try to reconstitute it in some different way. I think there would be, efforts to go to NATO or South Korea and say to them, look, we're not going to ask you much more for the common defense. That was just a Trump-centric sort of policy vision. We're much more vested in the alliance, and we're not going to put pressure on you like that anymore. I don't think you're going to see the Biden administration, try to, maybe alter and shape some of these trade deals. That would be in America's, best interest. I know we're going to talk about North Korea, but just extremely quickly, I would say that I think the Obama Biden administration would go back to some sort of strategic patience policy. And that's how you got a North Korea that has ICBMs that could be MIRV capable pretty soon. And those are weapons that they could sell to Iran. And that's what I'm worried about more than anything else, to be honest with you.
Well, I want to move on to the issue of globalism and multilateralism. President Trump and his supporters have been very critical of the foreign policy establishment, which they call globalists, and accuse them of putting the interests of the international elite ahead of the American people. And Vice President Biden and his supporters have been very critical of that. They think that the U.S. should work more closely in international alliances, should work more closely with the UN, and they criticize the Trump administration for alienating some of our European allies. Rebeccah, where do you come down on these issues?
Yeah, I mean, first thing, a couple points. One is for both the Biden camp and the Trump camp, it's really a matter of whose views are they weighting more heavily and in what order. And for the Trump administration, it is much more what do the American people want? What have they been saying? And so they weight that heavily. There's a real sense of trying to answer and respond to what the American people have been saying. And that's why you can, if you look at that principle and kind of flesh it out, you can see that manifested in trade, and trying to make sure that the United States isn't totally reliant on Chinese goods, isn't totally reliant on rare earth minerals that are made in China, that we can have greater sovereignty in the United States and rely more on ourselves and have greater economic resilience with our allies and partners so that we're not beholden to a authoritarian country like the Chinese government. And I think, Fred, that one of the perfect policy issues that clearly lays this out for the Trump administration is moving the American embassy to Jerusalem. That's something that was American law for years, bipartisan, passed, supported, and every president used the presidential waiver authority not to do that because of pressure from European countries that were afraid that it would cause unrest in the Middle East, that the Palestinians would be so upset and would cause greater problems. And so their views on what to do and what not to do in that area were weighted more heavily in previous administrations. Certainly, I cannot even imagine a Clinton administration or a Biden administration making such a bold move in the face of enormous pressure from allies and partners abroad, but doing what the American people want and moving our embassy to Jerusalem. So that's a great example. And so, and whenever you hear the media or whenever you look at polls that say, look, our U.S. standing in the world is down, our allies and partners don't take us seriously anymore, always press back. One, take polls with a grain of salt, but also look and see which partners and allies. Some of our partners and allies are very pleased with the change of course over the last few years. The Taiwanese are certainly happy. The Poles are generally happy. The Israelis are happy. Jimmy Lai, this great pro-democracy leader in Hong Kong, his major newspaper, Apple Daily, had a great op-ed endorsing a second term for the Trump administration. And we should be asking, why is it? Why do these other countries that have stood by the United States and are really in dangerous parts of the world, why do they see something positive coming out of this administration? And I think it's because it's a return to understanding that diplomacy, effective diplomacy, is always underscored and backed by American hard power and economic strength. And that's what this administration is more than anything. President Trump, he might not be this grand strategist. And by the way, few presidents are. So we'll put it on the table. But to Harry's point, he's a businessman. He's a real estate guy. But he does wear Team USA jersey. And so that's why, given sort of his intuition of Team USA, that lends itself to a correction from globalism.
This is good. I agree with all that. But how about Biden's criticism that we should work more closely with the United Nations and multilaterally in general?
Yeah, the problem with that is all of these institutions are not ends in of themselves. They are means to ends. So if the United States can work with them, I say let's do it. Let's give it a shot. If there's something like the UN Human Rights Council, which under Nikki Haley, the Trump administration pulled out of, the reason we did that was because it just became just this mouthpiece of anti-Israel policy, and it didn't differentiate between authoritarian countries and free democratic nations. And so it no longer serves the American interests. And so this love affair that some progressives have with international organizations, just because they're these international organizations, I mean, I think that is folly, and it has led to policies that have been bad for the United States of America, and it may be good for Europeans, or it may be good for some of these other countries that have conflicting interests with the United States, might be good for China, but it's been bad for the American people. And so the Trump administration is offering a course correction there. The Biden administration, again, it's to be determined, but you can see these different people who are very influential in the Biden camp, and they really are arguing for a return to the pre-Trump days, which I think would be a mistake.
I think that's right. Harry, where do you come down on this globalism versus multilateralism debate?
Fred, I think one of the challenges here is that we've taken this holiday from history, if you will, in a lot of respects. We've given a lot of these multilateral institutions like the UN, the World Health Organization, just pick your poison or whatever you want to say, and given them so much power and so much influence that I think one thing Trump forces us to remember again is that it's our country's national interests that are paramount above all else. And I don't care if you're a hard-nosed realist, more in the neoconservative camp, and I don't mean that in a pejorative sense. I just mean that as a sort of a framework, if you will. This is sort of the challenge that we have. And I think the great example for me, I just think about my own sort of personal history on this issue. I remember being a freshman at the University of Rhode Island back in 1997. So I'm dating myself here, okay? And I remember that we were given, I think, one of the Bibles of these, sorts of narratives. It was called Jihad versus McWorld. And what this book sort of laid out is how the world is going to be this panacea of open borders and institutions that were going to guide and shape all of our lives, and that a global business community was going to bring up international standards and living standards and health standards for everyone all over the world. Well, it hasn't exactly worked out the way we planned. And I think what Trump has sort of signaled to us, again, he is not a grand strategist. He is not somebody who's probably never heard of that book before. But he has brought us back to where all countries end up really building their foreign policies. What is in our national interest? And I think, a great example is the rise of China. I think, going back to, the early 1970s, Richard Nixon goes to China for a very specific reason. That's to use China essentially as a strategy to sort of push back against the Soviet Union and try to sort of diminish their rise, so to speak. And that was a good strategy all through the 80s, but Soviet Union collapses in 1989, and there was never that recalibration of policy when it came to China. And we put our hopes in multilateral institutions. We hoped that we could bring China into the national community, that we could shape their politics, shape their foreign policy. That has failed miserably. And I think what Trump does for us is he allows us to take a step back and say we've put too much into these multilateral institutions, and it is okay, and it is, you're not breaking some crazy political science, norm that you could say, no, I'm not going to agree with that the Paris Accords on climate change that put no restrictions on China and India to decrease their carbon emissions. I don't have to follow all these specific norms if it's not in our national interest, and I think that's a good thing. When it comes to
I want to move on, but I want to stay with you. You are a well-known expert in North Korea, and the president's personal diplomacy with Kim Jong-un is certainly one of his most significant foreign policy achievements, maybe his most controversial achievement. And I'll let you talk about what has been achieved here. But one aspect that I think is interesting, and it dovetails off of what you just said, is that this was bilateral diplomacy. China was not included. And I think that's a significant aspect of this. But I really would like to hear from the two of you about how we have done with North Korea, what President Trump would do in a second term, and how Joe Biden would handle this if he was president.
Fred, I'm just going to put myself out there and say my views on North Korea have changed a lot over the last few years. I used to be very hawkish on this issue. I was one of those guys on Fox News saying, no, President Trump, don't meet with Kim Jong-un. It's a big mistake. We're going to get played. You're legitimizing them. Look, I'm going to be honest. I think that vision was wrong now. And the reason I say that is I look at the data, I look at the evidence, and I think we have done everything we possibly can to try to get North Korea to denuclearize. They're not going to do it. That is not going to happen. And there's a very specific reason for that. And it's not the United States' fault, it's not the Trump administration's fault. There's a structural problem here that is not going to be solved. And that is when you try to put maximum pressure or sanctions on North Korea, the problem is 90% of North Korea's exports in one way or another go through China. And unfortunately, if we're trying to get Beijing to enforce what's in our national interest, to bring that up, there's going to be times where sometimes they're going to be on our side a little bit, and sometimes they're going to let those sanctions get weakened. It's happened countless times over the last 30 years. So I think the approach for North Korea makes a lot of sense now. I think where the Trump administration is eventually going is not saying to North Korea, we're going to accept you as a nuclear weapon state, but maybe de facto accepting that for now and trying to work on some sort of arms control regime where we limit their ability to grow all of these new capabilities. And we got a great example on that on October 10th when we saw their new, I guess what a lot of people are calling the Hwasong 16 monster ICBM, if you will, that could eventually allow them to have MIRV capability, that could allow them to challenge some of our missile defense platforms. I think that if we could limit that growth or stop that growth, not the perfect solution, but unfortunately, we don't have a lot of good options. Now, let me get
real quickly before I turn to Rebeccah. We have a lot of topics. Talk about what a Biden administration would do with North Korea.
Sure. To be honest with you, I think we're going back to strategic patience 2.0. I know there was a recent article in Yonhap in one of the big South Korean newspapers that Joe Biden would talk to Kim Jong-un in some sort of fashion, but it had a lot of qualifiers on it. And this has been in the New York Times and other areas where, Biden said he'd meet with Kim, but that would have to precede, working level talks that would bring them to some sort of agreement. Well, we know from history, Fred, that the North Koreans are terrible in working level talks. They have no power to make any critical decisions. In fact, if you go back to the run up to the Hanoi summit, the North Koreans said that they couldn't even deal with this on denuclearization and that Kim Jong-un would bring, quote, a present to Donald Trump, leaving Donald Trump to negotiate with Kim Jong-un. So I don't really have a lot of faith in this Biden, we'll talk to Kim sort of thing with all these qualifiers. I think what will happen is I think Joe Biden, if he does win, is going to have a policy review that's going to go from January to maybe March or April. And the North Koreans are just going to start testing missiles again. And we're going to go back to right where we were.
Yeah. Rebeccah?
Sure. I disagree on a couple different points and agree on a couple points. So I'll start with the good news on North Korea. The good news is because of this administration's approach to North Korea, that we have seen a pause. I would call it just a pause, not a total complete stop in intercontinental ballistic missile tests. Those are the missiles that can reach the United States, and nuclear tests as well. And the rhetoric has chilled out. So we've moved on from fire and fury. Fire and fury was a tense phase between the United States and North Korea. So that's good. The bad news is, and I will also say in the good news category too, the Trump administration has maintained sanctions. And so it hasn't buckled under this pressure from North Korea to relieve sanctions first in exchange for reversible dismantling of little component parts and pieces of the nuclear enterprise in North Korea. So I think that that's what distinguishes this administration's approach from previous administrations, certainly the Clinton administration, for agreeing to let go of some sanctions in exchange for things that would be reversible. The bad news is the North Korean program has improved during this time. There is no question in my mind there are more missiles. There is a larger nuclear program, and they've resumed testing of shorter range missiles, which can reach our allies and partners. And the point of that, and the reason that that's still bad for the United States, even though it doesn't reach us, it can reach U.S. forces, and it puts strain on the alliance and the security guarantees that we place to our allies. So when the President of the United States says they're just short range, but if they're the medium range kind that can reach Japan, that's bad. And we need to make sure that we have a unified front saying that all of that is unacceptable. They all violate UN Security Council resolutions that prohibit it. And so I think that the President of the United States is, if there is a Trump 2, we've got a problem on our hands. I don't think that the United States should accept that there is going to be a North Korean nuclear program. I think that sanctions should continue, pressure should continue. But I think the other part of this that we sometimes forget, it certainly isn't politically popular this close to the election, but it is true. One of the things that pushed us to the point where the North Koreans and the United States were having conversations was the credible threat of military force that came from Donald Trump. And it made a lot of people in the United States uncomfortable. It made the North Koreans uncomfortable. It wasn't one of these very polite Obama and Bush, all options are on the table, where everyone was like, really though? Are you really going to hit North Korea? When President Trump was talking about raining down fire and fury, everybody knew there was a chance it would absolutely happen. I'm actually supportive of this tension, with desiring diplomacy very much and preferring it above all else. but being willing to defend the American people to the utmost. And so I think that credible threat of force with sanctions in place, saying that the United States is never going to accept, certainly Japan won't, South Korea won't accept a North Korea with a nuclear capability that is expanding. That gives them coercive and compelling ability against the United States in our interests that I don't think that we should accept.
Okay,
Now, the Biden people.
What would Biden do on North Korea?
I think that I don't think anybody would believe Joe Biden if he threatened to do anything against North Korea. Uncle Joe doesn't really have that kind of presence. I think that a Biden administration, again, there's these kind of two camps inside the Biden kind of advisory groups. I don't know which one's going to win the day. You have some more of a hard power, confident wing. You know, Michelle Flournoy is sort of a good example of that, who's rumored to possibly be a Secretary of Defense candidate for Joe Biden, and she tends to have more have an awareness and appreciation for the usefulness and benefit of American hard power in diplomacy. But I don't have any confidence that we would make progress on this issue under a Joe Biden administration. I think that we would be back to Obama days of essentially just sort of tabling the issue, trying some sanctions, and not really knowing how to move the ball forward. And remember, this issue was what President Obama turned to President Trump and said, this is a primary problem that you're going to have to deal with. We were not able to make a lot of progress on this. So I'm very concerned on that issue with what a Biden administration, how it would handle the North Korea problem. The other thing I would say, Fred, real quick on that.
I'm going to move on because we're running out of time. And we have some big topics to talk about in this hour. Let's talk about the Middle East. This is an area that the Trump administration claims to have had some significant success pulling out of the nuclear deal with Iran, which was followed by substantial evidence by Israel that Iran was cheating on the deal from the agreement, knocking ISIS out on the ground, significantly improving relations with Israel, and significantly promoting the prospect for peace in the Middle East. Now, the Biden administration takes a different approach. It's pledged to rejoin the nuclear deal with Iran, but I don't frankly know what it is going to do concerning these other issues. What is your take on this, Rebeccah?
And this ties in well with your question that you put to Harry about forever wars. So I actually don't like that term because I think people have different ideas about what that means. But the approach towards the Middle East has been under the Trump administration that the primary malign actor in the region is Iran. Iran is the one that's destabilizing, and so to deal with the Middle East, which is not the threats from terrorists are not the primary threat facing the United States. It's now China as the major power, but the Middle East still has vexing problems and challenges, and you can't really compartmentalize great power competition to one particular region. It's really, we're competing for influence with the Chinese and the Russians in various theaters. But on that point, I mean, I think how the Trump administration has approached the Middle East is to say, yes, Iran is the primary threat driver, and then Israel is our primary ally in the region. And so you just put your flag down in those two areas, and you build a foreign policy around that. You work with Gulf partners around what our shared threats are, so that we can collaborate in that and pushing Iran back and balancing in that region, really because of the turmoil caused from really because of the Iraq War. That a lot of these problems have been created, these sectarian wars and violence, with the absence of a stable Iraq, and it has allowed for Iran to be more empowered and more influential in the region. And so you have the United States partnering with the Saudis, with the Emiratis, and you've got these peace treaties, the Abraham Accords, now with normalization between the UAE and Israel, Bahrain and Israel, and now it looks like we're going to see other countries follow suit. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, if it normalized relations with Israel, would be the big one. That's the big one, because it is the custodian of the two holy sites in Islam, Mecca and Medina. So that's the Trump approach. There has been not that the United States is going to pull out of the region, but it's going to use balancing of powers and work with partners and allies to try to bring relative peace, if not ever complete peace, in the Middle East, so that the United States can better focus on the primary threat to the United States and our interests, which is China.
Harry, what's your take?
Well, let me start with sort of the going back to the Obama years and how that's going to sort of shape a Biden presidency in terms of Middle East policy. Look, I think what Joe Biden's strategy is going to be in the Middle East is it's going to be, like I said, to try and rejoin some sort of reconstituted Iran nuclear deal. I'll be honest, I have very mixed emotions on the Iran nuclear deal. I think my overall approach is I don't like it for very two practical reasons that I think, Fred, you pointed out, and Rebecca, and probably many others. First thing is there's a time limit on it. It's not forever. It does not completely dismantle Iran's nuclear program forever. It just puts caps on it for a short amount of time. The second point, it does nothing to stop the proliferation and the qualitative, quantitative improvements in Iran's missile complex, which is guided by the North Koreans. So those are huge problems that I don't see the Biden administration tackling if they try to get some sort of new nuclear deal. So I think that's a huge problem. And I think the Biden administration, again, looking at the people who would guide Middle East policy, do not understand the fact that even if you were to get the Iranians to sign some sort of comprehensive nuclear deal, or at least what they think to be a comprehensive nuclear deal or even missile deal, is going to change Iran's actions in the Middle East. They are a rogue nation that spreads terrorism, that spreads carnage through, pick your country, Syria, Yemen, the borders of Israel. I mean, they are the definition of a rogue state. So that is the problem I see it when it comes to the Biden administration. They don't get that problem. And I don't think they have any practical solutions to solve that. Looking at what Trump would do in a second term, I think it's pretty clear. I think Rebecca laid that out well. I think he is going to continue on with the same policy approaches that I think have guided him well. I think what he's going to try and do is in places like Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria, draw down forces, but not completely leave. I think that's the right approach. I think abandoning those areas, especially in Syria, you invite ISIS to return. If you leave Afghanistan, you might be allowing the Taliban to reform its terrorist roots, and you might see the potential for 9/11 style attacks. That would be a tragedy considering the trillions of dollars spent and the American lives that have been sacrificed because of this. So I don't think Trump would do that. I think he would stay the course, but a lighter footprint, and I think that makes sense. I think that's the right thing to do. When it comes
Harry, I want to fit in one more question before we open questions to the audience. We can't end this seminar without talking about China, and I wanted to start with you. We know the president's been very aggressive on free and fair trade with China. He's called out the Chinese Communist Party as being a destabilizing influence for global peace, and he has called out the Chinese Communist Party for being responsible for the spread of the coronavirus. And I know this is a lot to talk about in a short time, but could you start on your take on this weighty issue?
Sure, Fred. This is my favorite part of Trump's foreign policy. Before Trump came into office, I think in Washington, depending if you talk to think tankers, policymakers, whoever's in the know on China, influencers, if you will, there was sort of this 50-50 split. You had some people who were for this internationalist approach, trying to shape China's rise. And then you had another group who were called hawks on China, people like Robert O'Brien, people like Peter Navarro, that were said, oh, they're too hawkish on China. Trying to contain China is a bad idea. Trying to contain their military rise is a bad idea. That's xenophobic. That's not the 21st century way of the world. Well, it's pretty clear that President Trump has adopted that worldview, and I mean that positively. And I think if you look at the things that China has done, specifically since the early 2000s, in transforming their military into a very sophisticated anti-access area denial platform, if you will, to deny the United States the ability to come into theater in a crisis, whether we're talking South China Sea, Taiwan, East China Sea, even a North Korea contingency, to be honest with you. The Trump administration finally understands that problem and has done a lot to reshape the posture of the U.S. military in the Asia Pacific to confront that threat. So we are able to stay in region no matter what China tries to do. That strategy is ongoing, but I think they've done a really good job at having a laser focus on that problem and making sure that that is something that we can tackle, that we don't get pummeled in thousands of Chinese missiles. So I think that for me, that is the biggest sort of takeaway. If you look at other parts of our challenge with China, the first thing that Trump did is actually, he didn't tackle the military component of this right away. He focused on the core of how China has risen to prominence, to power, how it has a $12 trillion economy. And that's its economic rise, which has been created on the backbones of stolen American jobs, stolen intellectual property, over $1 trillion in stolen military platforms from U.S. defense contractors. He's the first president to say, no, we are not going to allow this to happen anymore. And you're going to pay a price if you're going to continue on with this mercantilist economic strategy. And a lot of people said to people like Peter Navarro and others, how can you talk about tariffs? This is the 21st century. That's from the 1930s. We don't do that anymore. But you know what? Trump stayed the course. He took the heat. I don't care if you don't like some of the things that Trump says, some of the languages he used, maybe the things he says on Twitter.
Let me ask you a quick question before I turn it over to Rebeccah. We know from U.S. intelligence that China wants Joe Biden to win the election. I think that's a very interesting question. Could you briefly talk about that and what you think Biden's policy would be towards China if he wins the election?
I'll give you an example. The Obama administration, they had this very stupid idea of freedom of navigation operations as some sort of crazy way to deter the Chinese. And it goes something like this. We're going to sail U.S. naval vessels through areas of the South China Sea as ways to try and say, hey, we're not going to allow you to limit freedom of navigation, and the Chinese would laugh at us. Those were some of the things, those were some of the great ideas, if you will, that I think a Biden administration would offer. I think they would not place tariffs on the Chinese if they stole intellectual property or didn't follow some of these trade agreements that the Trump administration had. We would go back to this fable of trying to shape China's rise, to bring them back in the international community, to make them a global stakeholder, if you will. It doesn't work, Fred. And I think we're going to just go back to that same posture. I think also what you might see in a Biden administration is the weakening and changing of our approach to military posture in the Asia Pacific, not taking into account these A2AD platforms the Chinese are developing. And I think that'd be a huge mistake.
Rebeccah, what's your take?
Yeah, I think the Trump administration views China as the primary threat facing the United States and our way of life. I think the Biden people do not. And that's the driving difference between these two candidates for president and the way defense and foreign policy will be conducted. If you believe that China is, and let's flesh that out for just a little bit here. If you look across cabinet officials, you've seen the Attorney General, Barr, you've seen Secretary of the Defense, Secretary of State, the FBI Director, the National Security Advisor, the Deputy National Security Advisor, have all come out and explained in their various in their areas, their portfolios, how China is threatening the United States' system and our way of life, whether it's intellectual property theft, whether it's censorship in academia, censorship in big business, economic espionage. Yes, you've got the hard power piece of threatening the United States' freedom of navigation and action in that particular region of the world. Threatening our space assets and what their military is developing. And really what they're doing in that particular region is threatening the United States' ability to make good on our security commitments with Japan and with South Korea, with Vietnam, with those other countries. And the United States has promised to maintain a free and open Indo-Pacific for responsible actors. And that's what China's threatening. If they can achieve that and push us out of the region, they've effectively taken the mantle of global leader from the United States. We would no longer be the primary Pacific power. It'll be China and everything that goes along with it in terms of us being beholden to China because of how dependent we are on that particular region of the world for trade and economic prosperity. And so China is really, it's taken a whole of government approach from the United States' perspective to really start pushing back. And this is a long haul. We're not going to fix this in the next couple of years, in the next term. This is going to be over many, many years. But this administration has really gotten the United States on sounder footing to confront this threat. And so what I'm concerned about is that Joe Biden has 47 years of views in American government. And so if we look at his track record on this, he, as of a year ago, Joe Biden was saying that China did not pose a serious threat to the United States. Now, some of his rhetoric has changed a little bit, although the American media has not been pressing him on China in defense and foreign policy. So some people try to tell me who work for Biden or work around Biden that he's going to be tough on China. I don't know what that means yet because we haven't heard it say it. So I can only go on his record. And this is not a man who believes that China poses a serious threat to the American people, and that is concerning. I don't want to see the progress that this administration has made squandered in another in the next administration, because this is going to take bipartisan effort, help, and we're going to have to sustain this over the long term, over the long haul.
Thank you, Rebeccah and Harry. I'm now going to bring my colleague Adam Savitt in and invite our viewers to ask us questions. If you haven't already texted us questions, there's still time, and I'll turn this over to Adam.
Where do never Trumpers fit into this? Are their interests the same as the Democrats?
I'll go ahead and take that first. This has been something that has been frustrating and confounding for me, because many of the national security experts that I have thought agreed with me on sort of my view of American foreign policy over many years have now jumped ship, and they're against President Trump, and really even have a hard time acknowledging the accomplishments that have been made. I've heard a lot of excuses that, all of the accomplishments, from the Abraham Accords to shifting to confronting China, to pushing back and countering on Iran, would have happened regardless of who was president. And all those accomplishments happened in spite of Donald Trump, not because of anything he's done. I find that incredibly unpersuasive and disingenuous. I do think that there is a risk of President Trump's excesses harming some of his agenda items. For instance, if the United States is going to be successful in countering China over the long haul, we need allies and partners. We are no longer a unipolar power. This is not just the United States and then, the next power far, far, far in a distant distance away in terms of power and ability, like we were really what the Clinton administration inherited and squandered. We now are, it's multipolar. And so the United States needs to regain our military and economic preeminence and pull away where it's begun to shrink versus China. But we need allies and partners. And so even though the president has been tough on allies and partners and it has produced some good fruit, we need to make sure that we're being very careful not to undermine alliances and partnerships that are going to be critical for deterring China and building economic resiliency, so that, these liberal democratic countries that we value so much and prioritize have long lives and do not just simply become subsumed by the Chinese Communist Party.
Harry, any thoughts on the Never Trumpers?
Yeah, just quickly. I mean, look, one of the things about the Never Trumpers is, at least for me, looking at them, I think a lot of their problems with Donald Trump aren't necessarily policy driven. I just don't think they like some of the rough language that he uses sometimes, some of the tweets that he puts out that I'd say sometimes are needlessly provocative. I'll be honest, I'm not a fan of a lot of those actions either. I'm just not. I'm just gonna put it out there. But for me, what's always bothered me about the Never Trumpers is that it's pretty clear that if you look at Trump's policies, not the things that he says on Twitter, are pretty conservative. And a lot of these Never Trumpers are bedrock conservatives. So for me, what I wish they'd be able to do is, I think it'd be much more constructive. Instead of attacking the president every tweet, everything he does to try to capture the media cycle, because that's what he's trying to do. I don't think you need to be a media expert to figure that out. I think it would be much more constructive to at least back the president in the areas where you might have, some overlapping agendas, especially on China, especially on Russia. I mean, this administration has been very tough on Russia in terms of sanctions, in trying to make NATO allies pay more for the common defense. I think those are really good things. I think some Never Trumpers have tried to sort of pull back that affiliation. I think, a lot of people who've signed some of those Never Trump letters probably regret it now, and that's okay. That's fine. But I think there's a lot more areas of commonality, and I just wish that they'd be honest about that, because I think that's a good thing.
Yeah, if I can say one more thing on that too, I actually see it a little bit differently. What this has revealed to me is people who I thought agreed with me on goals and what we're trying to achieve. It's actually been revealed over the last 4 years we have very different goals. And so I think some of these Never Trumpers have been revealed over the last 4 years. They're not really conservative at all, or they don't have the same sort of traditional conservative internationalist or conservative nationalist, whatever flavor of conservative foreign policy you sort of fit into, that they're not those things at all. And I can see that in their writing, because the things that they're upset with President Trump about are the things that I think are fantastic. pulling out of the INF treaty, which the Russians were cheating on, so that we can actually now deploy these kinds of weapon systems to counter China, for instance. Getting out of the Iran deal, because the Iran deal was just emboldening and empowering and enriching the Iranian government. So I actually think, Donald Trump is not he's not the great communicator like Ronald Reagan was, but he is the great clarifier. And I think the last 4 years have been very clarifying about what people actually care about in terms of what they believe are good policies. That doesn't mean I don't think criticisms are warranted of this administration and this president. They surely are. But I think if you prefer a Biden administration over a Trump administration, those two have very different worldviews about how to conduct American foreign policy and what our interests are. And so I think if you're supportive of a Biden administration, you certainly don't have a conservative view in defense and foreign policy.
I want to make a brief comment before I move on to Adam. It's funny what you said about these never Trumpers, because I work with some of these so-called never Trumper Republicans when I was at the State Department. They didn't seem to be Republicans then, and I don't think they're Republicans now. And I look at people like Corey Shockey at AEI, who runs their foreign policy shop, who, if she's a Republican, I can't figure it out. And I think these people, they're not really Republicans. They wouldn't be for a Republican candidate if Trump wasn't the candidate. So anyway, that's my take on that. Adam?
What would happen to Trump's America First agenda and strategy if Biden should become president and push his globalistic approach? Are there people who would pick up the mantle and continue to push it forward, perhaps behind the scenes?
I can take that. I mean, again, I think that there really are two camps within the Biden foreign policy camp, kind of trying to fight with each other over what's going to win the day. There are those who think that, yes, the Trump administration, through their national defense strategy, has begun to carry out a policy and has pushed hard issues that the bipartisan consensus has been really uncomfortable doing, and that we need to continue to build on that progress. Though I don't think it would ever be to the same tempo and same pressure and same degree that a second Trump term would. And then again, there's that other camp that I think would try to just basically go back on a double apology tour, Obama apology tour times two, saying we're so sorry about that Donald Trump guy and all of his supporters. Please, America is back. And then it takes an approach that's much more favorable towards what the European Union wants and lets them be in the driver's seat. So, I mean, it depends. About who wins the day and who is more influential inside a Biden administration.
Fred, if I may, let me just jump on that question quickly, because I think it's an important one. Let me tease that out a little bit. And let's say Donald Trump does lose. I think there will be a lot of different camps that will try to pick up this America First, if you will, sort of foreign policy doctrine and try to incorporate into their own thinking, ideas, strategies, whatever. Let me just give you a couple of quick examples. I think it's known in DC that the Charles Koch Institute has a lot of interest in sort of reshaping American foreign policy. I think they have a lot of good ideas. There's a new group at the Atlantic Council that's also taking a very similar approach. Now, a lot of people may not like those ideas, and I think it's good to debate them and to think those through. But I think one thing that none of us can deny, no matter where you sit in terms of your foreign policy views, is that America has to do a better job of making really good, smart foreign policy choices of where we're going to put our blood and treasure. And I think Donald Trump has done a good clarifying job, if I can use your term, Rebeccah, of trying to make that case, if you will, of where to put our dollars and cents. And let's face it, we're going to have to make some very difficult decisions over the next few years. The United States right now, due to lots of budget deficits and now coronavirus, is $27 trillion in debt right now. US GDP, I mean, depending on how you slice or dice it, I think per year is $21 trillion a year. So we are over 100% debt to GDP. That is World War II levels of debt. That is horrendous. And that's the Republicans and Democrats bear that responsibility. Obviously, coronavirus, we had to spend to make sure the American people are safe, secure, and prosperous. But whoever is president in come January 20th, 2021, is going to have to make some tough choices. We are not going to be able to be the world's policeman. We are not going to be able to be the nation builder of the world. We're going to have to make some smart and tough choices. And I think that's worthy of debate.
Is there danger of ISIS returning as a significant force as it was under Obama?
I think that the answer to that is yes. But I think, a different approach from the Trump administration has been listen, we're going to be dealing with nation states and not international, transnational organizations as primary actors, meaning we're going to balance powers in the region to help counter some of these threats. We're going to keep some kind of presence there so that the United States can help lead. You don't want the United States to totally just sort of wash our hands of these problems, because even though it's not a primary threat in the region, it's still going to be a problem. And we don't want to see a return of the caliphate. But it is, this administration did finish the job in terms of destroying, I think, 99% of the physical caliphate of ISIS. But now you're gonna sometimes leadership means delegating to allies and partners to help maintain the progress that we have made in the region. The other thing too about the Trump administration, I hope that even if you see the subsequent administrations beyond this next election, Donald Trump has sort of broken this sort of, I don't know, zombie-like trance that we've been in to say that we can't do certain things, otherwise the international liberal world order will fall apart, as though that were sort of a thing held together by the WHO and the UN Human Rights Council. And we certainly can't take out Qasem Soleimani when he's in Iraq, because then we're going to be at war with Iran. And we certainly can't move our embassy to Jerusalem, because that's going to cause World War III. He's done some things that have been good for the United States and put us in a better position, for, a safer place for our troops who are deployed in that region. And we're still able to carry out some of our objectives apart from these institutionalized organizations like the WHO or the UN Human Rights Council. The United States is still leading.
I'm going to stop you there and we're running out of time. I want to give Harry a chance to talk about whether ISIS could be coming back.
Just very quickly, what I would say is that I think it would be a tragic mistake to do what we did in Iraq, which is to just basically, pull our troops out, no strategy, no idea of what comes next, and here comes the rise of ISIS. I mean, look, power vacuums are very real things. We could go through history and find countless examples of them. So I think, irregardless of who's president, again, come January 20th, I think what needs to happen is it's important to have a small force there for intelligence gathering, maybe to ensure that we have drones, UAVs in area to conduct operations as needed to make sure that ISIS never, ever returns. And I think that's a very small investment, and I think it's the right investment. Again, irregardless of where you sit on the geopolitical spectrum, if you will.
Adam, I think we have time for one more question with very short answers.
What would Biden's response be to the Chinese encroachment in Africa and South America?
I mean, the short answer for me is just that I just don't know. It depends on how seriously he takes the threat of China. If the comments that he's made in the last year that China doesn't really pose a threat, I don't know if there's going to be a serious concerted effort to make sure that the United States is shoring up what our interests are in the regions and that we're competing with intentionality and purpose in that region.
Just very, very quickly, what I would say is I do worry about things like the Belt and Road Initiative, where China goes into Africa, goes into countries like Angola and other parts that don't have very strong governments, don't have the ability to resist billions of dollars in cheap loans to build infrastructure, and then these governments aren't even able to maintain that infrastructure, and they still owe the money, or they have to pay it back in millions of barrels of oil. So I think these are things that we have to be watchful and mindful of, for sure.
Well, Rebeccah Heinrichs and Harry Kazianis, thank you so much for this whirlwind panel. I'm sorry I had to cut you off, but I wanted to get to as much material as possible so we could have a robust discussion comparing the foreign policies of both presidential candidates, so American voters can consider this when they cast their ballots this fall. We're going to have a super panel next week, which I'm going to let my colleague Adam Savitt describe to you.
Well, as I mentioned at the top of the program, this is our final webinar next week, Wednesday, October 28th at 1 p.m. The title is Post-Election Insurrection, the Civil Unrest in the Coming Months, featuring author, lecturer, and national security veteran of the Trump and Bush 43 administrations, Michael Anton. As the election day looms, riots continue on a near nightly basis in progressive strongholds like Portland, while free speech activists and Trump supporters are assaulted and have events broken up around the country. Some Democrat Party-aligned groups are preparing for a street fight, not a legal one, in the event of an unclear election results, while Antifa-aligned groups threaten general strikes, disruptions, and violence that exceed even the recent BLM protests if President Trump appears to be the victor on November 3rd. To discuss these topics, Anton will be joined by my colleagues, Michael Waller, our Senior Analyst for Strategy, and Kyle Scheidler, our Senior Analyst for Homeland Security and Counterterrorism, and he recently testified before a Senate subcommittee on the history and organization of Antifa. So we hope you'll join us for that next week. Register on securefreedom.org. With that, we'll wish you a happy afternoon. Thanks a lot.